Hello. Welcome back, all of you. As you already know, I'm Masood Raja, and I'm back after a brief break in our weekly webinars, and I hope you will all join me today. We were actually in the process of moving our house, and as you can see, I'm with a new backdrop. This is my apartment. So yeah, we've been busy with that. So while I was trying to record some videos and upload them, I was, also getting quite a few queries, mostly about how to use theory to write a research paper or write a thesis. But some particular questions were about how to use our knowledge of globalization, neoliberalism, IMF policies, and things like that to write a scholarly work. So today we'll be talking about that. So the general topic is how to use knowledge of economic theory, economic policies to write a humanities paper or a thesis or a dissertation. And of course, I will be really grateful for your questions. If you ask any questions, that would really help a lot. Now, let me welcome people. So I think Saleh is here. Welcome, Literature Studio, welcome. And as you come in, just please feel free to introduce yourself. And I would love to say hi to you. So going into today's topic, when I put globalization in the title of today's webinar, I don't just mean the general term globalization. Those of us who do some sort of progressive or leftist scholarship, we always qualify globalization by neoliberal globalization. And if you are curious about it, of course, you can watch my whole previous webinar on neoliberalism, my webinar on globalization. There are quite a few videos on it too. So that will give you some background knowledge. So unless someone particularly would like to know more about it, I will just sort of assume that you have a rough idea of what neoliberalism and globalization is. But I'll maybe take a few moments to explain it too. So here, another one of our very old supporters, Oroko, is back. Welcome back. I'm sorry I missed all of you guys. And then we have late Tayyib Hamid. Okay. And cool. Okay, so welcome you all. Okay, and Kinza, welcome. All right, so let me briefly explain, what do we understand by neoliberalism or neoliberal globalization? And basically, neoliberalism, literally or metaphorically, what it means is when the conservative economists pull out certain things from the liberal economists of 19th century or early 20th century, like people like Adam Smith and others. And the assumptions in neoliberal economics are that markets are the main regulators of capitalism. Government should not intervene much, right? And we should let the market decide what rises and what falls. And that if the rich could keep more of their money, hence reduce their taxes, they'll go and produce jobs. And when they'll create jobs, wealth from them will trickle down. These are some of the assumptions. The philosophical assumptions about human nature are that we all are by our nature self-maximizers, that we want to do better, right? So if we create an environment where there is less government regulation, each one of us will go and seek our own personal self-interest. And in the process, we'll create a society of people who are self-maximizers, and everything will rise up. The problem with that argument, of course, is that we are assuming a universal self-interest, that everyone's self-interest is the same. But even if you go read Adam Smith and his chapter on labor, you will realize that no, the self-interest of the capitalists and workers are completely opposed to each other. The capitalist wants to extract more labor for less money. The worker wants to give less labor for more money, right? So if we assume a universal self-interest, we are probably assuming the self-interest of the dominant class, right? So these are some of the things to keep in mind. Now, you might have also encountered the term the global village and global culture. All of these terms serve a purpose, right? Because they serve the purpose of the dominant. If you just assume that the world has become one because of Facebook and YouTube and all that, whose interest does it serve, right? Because if you assume that the status quo is the real, then whosoever is in the dominant position have made you part of their project because you've stopped questioning the system. So anytime you see the term global village or this big tent world and all, do keep in mind that these are loaded terms and they have a politics. And the politics is to offer the world in which we live as natural, right? And the order in which it exists also as natural. And our job as humanities scholars is, of course, to question that. So, how do we take some of these insights and some of these knowledges and use it in our classes, but also in our writing? And this is a question that perplexes a lot of people. So, knowledge of globalization and economics is just like any other knowledge, just like reading your Marx, reading your Foucault. You can approach it from any different position. The only thing that to keep in mind is that you have to explain your terms, right? So I have a whole webinar on how to write a research paper. If you just follow that pattern, that you start with what you are trying to say, you know, IMF is an oppressive institution, whatever. I mean, that wouldn't be a good thesis. And then, since we deal with literature and humanities, we are reading stories, we are reading poems, we are reading novels that create a world of their own, that represent something to the readers, right? So it could be a question of representation. You could pick up a novel, How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia. Is it satirical? Is it ironic? If it is satirical, what is it satirizing, right? And what it is satirizing is this idea that anyone who's innovative enough can make a lot of money in today's capitalism, right? But if it is an earnest representation of the world, just like you asked in Marxism, whose worldview is represented as normal, right? If the poor are failing in this, what are the causes of that? Are they attributed to the individual person, or are there instances of structural inequalities that are making someone's lives better? So, what is the novel or the short story normalizing? What is it steeped in, right? And that's where your knowledge of globalization and how the global economy works will come in handy, because the novelists are writing in the today's world. And the questions to pose would then be, are they challenging the way the world works, or are they normalizing that and want us to work within that, whatever limited role we might have at it? That's one way of using this knowledge in a paper or in a thesis. So, okay, Fatima, welcome. Infinita, welcome back. No problem. And so these are some of my thoughts. Now, the perplexing question a lot of people have is, how to use this theoretical knowledge to write a paper or to write a thesis. And so my formula is that you start with what you want to say about anything. I will write about Rohinton Mistri's A Fine Balance, right? What do I want to write about it? that the novel is a great example of the precarity that is produced in neoliberal capital in the far-flung parts of the world, in this case in India. And then you give your explanation, your understanding of how the global economy works, right? So you will give a few passages of your own understanding. You will cite people who have explained it, right? Since you have used the term precarity, then you might also want to go and see who has theorized it. What does it mean, right? And then within the novel, you will go and analyze what are the global or local imperatives of economy, of politics, that make the lives of these three characters precarious, right? And that's the first step. Beyond that, then we also discuss, what do we learn from it? What do we take from that novel as we discuss it? Does it mobilize us to think more critically of the kind of world in which we exist? Can we come up with some modes of challenging it, some modes of thinking differently about it? So these are like just my off the cuff ideas. I actually wrote an article on Rohinton Mistri's novel, and it should be coming out probably this year. Now, another question that came to me was from Jamaica. Someone was writing a thesis about the impact of IMF policies on Jamaican culture and its representations in fiction and in, Jamaican writing. And that also, you can apply the same rules to it. If you're going to talk about IMF policies, give your reader an understanding of what do you understand IMF to be, right? Read up on it. Now, we all know that IMF is one of the three Bretton Woods institutions. What were the Bretton Woods? You don't have to explain it in your paper, but you need to know it, right? So the Bretton Woods institutions were the three institutions created by the victorious Second World War powers. They met in this small town in Vermont called Bretton Woods and decided that they need to build a mechanism so that the world economy remains stable. So the World Bank was one of those. International Monetary Fund was the second of those. And the third one was then called General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and it's now called the World Trade Organization. Now, out of these, IMF deals with short-term loans, right? This is the institution you go to if your economy has a cash shortfall and you need to fill that gap, so you borrow money from IMF. IMF has its shareholders. Those are the most powerful nations in the world. So when you borrow money from IMF, then you have to agree to their terms. Part of the agreement is that you will not spend this money on non-developmental expenditure or on long-term planning of your economy, because the loan is meant to fill the shortfall. And so because of that, education, healthcare, and everything else becomes, non-developmental expenditure. Now, once you owe money to IMF, then the agreement that you have made also forces you to create policies that secure that loan, right? So IMF then has the power to come to you and say, you need to increase your taxes, you need to not spend too much money on this, you need to not spend too much money on that. So their role becomes more and more intrusive. And so most developing nations since 1973 are trapped in this IMF debt trap, right? They can't even pay back those debts. They are just servicing those debts. Every budget year, the first line in their budget is to pay the interest on the IMF loan. On the other hand, IMF has the power to restructure your economy. How can they coerce you to do that? Well, if you fail, if you don't pay your interest on time, or if you don't implement the policies, no one will trade with you. You will become a pariah nation and your economy would tumble because the economy is still global. Now, how does IMF then safeguard the interest of the powerful nations? That is because the voting system in IMF is what is called, it's weighted, right? So every country has a vote, but the value of your vote is connected to your GDP. So United States, I mean, I'm just using hypothetical examples. Every time United States votes, it's not counted as one vote, it's probably counted as 80 votes, right? So that means the developing nations do not even have the power, even if they have the numbers, to change IMF policy or its functioning, because they do not have enough weighted votes to change anything. So this is some of the knowledge that you have to bring to bear in your understanding of IMF, right? Then you, if you're writing about Jamaica, then you go to like, give us a little bit of history. When did Jamaica get entrapped into this IMF debt trap? Now, I always mention 1973, and those of you from Pakistan would probably understand it better. In pretty much all Muslim countries where, young and educated people talk about, oh, we got America and the West, they always talk about the oil embargo of 1973, right? When OPEC stopped sending oil to the NATO and others. And it's like, yeah, we showed the Americans what we are about. No, we didn't show the Americans what we are about. Americans went through it. But what happened because of the oil embargo in 1973 was that the emerging economies of post-colonial nations immediately went into crisis because they were short of cash. And that is when they went to IMF to get short-term loans and got entrapped into those loans. So part of the reason for the 1973 shortfall in their budgets was this very pseudo-heroic thing that we talk about, that the OPEC oil embargo, taught America a lesson. That was one of the primary material causes for that. So you bring that knowledge, and then you say, okay, this is when Jamaica got caught into that trap. And then since you're a literature scholar, you're going to then go and see what kind of representations are there of that. What kind of life is really being represented in a novel or in a short story. And then you can connect that life not to just the individual acts of failure, but to the policies that predetermine in so many ways what your lot will be in life. So that would be one way of using that knowledge. Okay, I have a question. Is there any way to deconstruct the way of IMF in order to put the nation out of the quagmire as you are explaining? First of all, I mean, I don't know how you're using the term deconstruct. I mean, I see it as completely differently. But yeah, there is a way out of it. Is first of all, familiarize yourself what you're dealing with. Ask your leaders to know what they're talking about. As public, you ought to know what you're talking about. And then the best way is to build a coalition of nations. Join all the other developing nations who have been constantly fighting that these debts should be forgiven, right? As an individual nation, there is not much you can do. You refuse to pay the IMF debt, your economy will go into crisis. So the best way is through solidarity with other nations, because by and large, those of us on the left understand that these debts need to be forgiven. And then, of course, develop your own infrastructures, develop your local economy, local industry. There are very few countries that, like India pretty much is no longer under the IMF influence. China is no longer under the IMF influence. But if your nation is, some of the policies maybe are absolutely needed, But the problem with restructuring policies is because they are geared towards recovering the debt or stabilizing the debt. They are not geared towards creating a long, viable culture. So sometimes what you will be doing to appease IMF could very easily further fragment your country, right? And that's where your understanding of how does a government build its legitimacy. I mean, that's another thing which you can see through economic theory. Why do people accept a government as a good government, right? So there are two registers under which governments justify themselves. One is through good works, through redemptive works, right? And two, by promising security to their people. Now, since 1980s, the governments have lost their ability to perform good works because the solution to all the problems is privatize this, privatize that, because the myth is that privatization is more profitable and less wasteful. Government is wasteful, right? So when you go and privatize everything, people are not beholden to you. Like if you read your HLMMB, how does government create loyalties? Through social debt, right? What is social debt? Government says, I will take care of you when you're sick, I'll give you education, and I'll give you a job and a pension. In return, people stay loyal to the government. That's where they look to when they need help. You eliminate all of that and privatize those functions, then people's loyalties would be with their local elite, with the industrialist, with any military leader who leads the Taliban or this and that, because they don't owe anything to the government. So I can give you like a good example of that is, for example, um, Pakistan Railways, right? It was established during the British time. It employs about 80,000 people, right? It's still not very efficient. Not much has been invested in it, but the trains run on time. But the most important part is it employs about 80,000 people. Now, a Japanese company comes to the Pakistani prime minister and says, give us the contract for Pakistan Railways, privatize it, we will make it profitable, and we will run it with 400 people, right? That's a brilliant idea. We'll make it profitable, you'll make more money, there'll be less wastage, but it will also create 80,000 people who would suddenly become jobless. Previously, these people, no matter where they lived, one guy in Kokrapar changing the track once a day or twice a day, living in a small hut, to the guy in Peshawar, right? Each one of them owed social debt to the government because they got their salaries every month. They understood this is our government, this is my job. You couldn't walk up to them and say, hey, come and join us and we'll blow the railway track. Because it's like, no, man, this is my livelihood. So that is another non-financial but symbolic function of the government that we lose when we start implementing ipso facto all the IMF policies. This is the knowledge that you can take to reading of any novel. How are people represented in there? Are unions represented as evil? Are workers represented as inherently, bad or terrible? And then you go and trace the backstory. What causes that? What causes that violence? What causes that kind of disinterest of each other? And that's where economic theory, you can go to it simply through economic theory or through Marx or Marxism. But these are some of the ways of using this knowledge to write about literature. Okay, so Bigari, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us. Oroko, uh, International Ministry, that's now understood. So yeah, IMF as an International Ministry of Finance. Well, yeah, in a way, but also keep in mind, Joseph Stiglitz has a beautiful book on it. How I'll post a link to the edited version of this, but that book basically talks about the inherent stupidity of some of IMF actions. Now, Stiglitz is a Nobel laureate as an economist and also worked for the World Bank, which is a completely different institution. And he gives an example of Ethiopia, right? He says that, okay, the poorest country in the planet, I think they owed about $320 million to IMF, right? Their new government comes in and they realize, okay, if we could pay down this debt, we could do much better. So what they do is they take their airline as a collateral to a private investor and borrow money on a lower interest rate than what they were paying to IMF, right? And they take that money and they take that plan to IMF and they say, okay, we are doing this and we are paying you off. And IMF insisted that they could not do that. And that's where Stiglitz was saying that this was IMF not even thinking of itself as a financial institution. Because if they thought of it as a financial institution, this makes perfect sense because it was a financially sound decision. You have you have a loan on a higher interest rate, you have some collateral, you go take a loan on a lower interest rate and pay off the higher interest rate loan. But IMF, according to Stiglitz, was thinking as an imperial institution and not a financial institution. So I highly recommend Joseph Stiglitz writing on the IMF policies and their destructive nature. So it means any privatization would certainly deprive many local people who are earning their bread and butter in that department. Doesn't it seem the start of colonization again through economy? I don't know. I mean, I have never felt that post-colonial nations were actually free. I mean, they get political freedom, but they immediately then have to sign off originally either with Warsaw Pact or with NATO or United States. So I don't see it as a new form of colonialism. I see it as an economic colonialism that has never left. There are or were very few autonomous nations economically or financially, and now increasingly they are more and more dependent upon the international financial institutions. So this whole idea of autonomy and being independent, it's a fiction that our leaders throw around here and there. I mean, if you look at Pakistan right now, with all the sloganeering and everything, for the last 3 years, Pakistan has been implementing every single mandate of IMF. All of that is proffered to the people as good for the nation. Maybe it is good to have a tax base and all that. But if there was no IMF mandate, if there was no IMF pressure on the government, I think their priorities would be different. So I'm not saying privatization is always bad. What I'm saying is that privatization is always offered as more efficient way of doing things in opposition to the government waste. Here too, right? But there are few things that private industry cannot do. A national educational system must be run by the government because it is the only institution that can afford to do that. Institutions can only be built by the state, right? And so instead of saying, let's eliminate state institutions and privatize them, we should rather work on changing them and reforming them and making them better and more responsive to the people. But the idea shouldn't be that it's government owned, so it's not good, so let's privatize it, and somehow it will automatically become better. Okay, Muhammad of Asaf would the withdrawal of American troops not be affecting Pakistan's religio-political fabric, empowering extremist elements? I mean, yeah, it would be, but why does Pakistan need America and Afghanistan to save its own fabric? I mean, yeah, it's always good to have someone to blame, and I am no apologist for American foreign policy, right? But Pakistan's religious or political fabric was already being frayed when Americans were not in Afghanistan. Pakistan made the decision to support the most brutal regime in Afghanistan, which was the Taliban. And there are consequences of that. One consequence of that is that those in Afghanistan who were opposed to the Taliban and who were killed by the Taliban, of course, didn't like Pakistan doing that, right? Two, by supporting the Taliban regime, Pakistan also became a party with a regime which can then transport those ideologies into Pakistan, whether America is there or not. Look, as a nation, any nation, the easiest path for the politicians is to blame someone outside. And that is right when it's the question of neoliberalism that we are talking about, that so much of what a nation can do is overdetermined by the financial restraints that IMF and others have on them. But there ought to also be some accountability of national actions of the previous governments, of the current government, right? Um, if Pakistan is not in support of Taliban and doesn't like the kind of politics that they represent, it's very simple, the question. Go on an international forum and say, we will not negotiate with the Taliban, right? Because even if we negotiate with them, what is it? What kind of a world will they create? I have published materials on this, right? You don't negotiate with people who say, we want to do this, this, and this, which includes incarcerating women in their households, you know, going and killing anyone that you don't like and who's not from the same sect as you. How can you agree to that, right? So I don't care whether Americans leave or stay there, right? What I care about is the lives and future of the Afghan people, and that they should be able to determine it, and that the lives of Pakistani people, that they should be able to determine what kind of life they want to live. If they want to be Islamic, there is nothing wrong with it, as long as they don't make it into a staff to beat other people with, right? Um, okay, cool. How do you see the Pakistani PM Imran Khan's statement about not allowing the American in Pakistan? I haven't read the majority of it, but I myself would be opposed to it. Because I don't want America or any other power to use any nation as a launching pad. So I think as a national leader, there is no other decision he can make. I mean, it's not a very visionary decision. Imagine if he allows the bases in Pakistan, what will happen to him politically, right? So even if there were someone else, not Imran Khan, they would have made the same decision, you know. Um, Okay, Abraham, data do not show that Ethiopia is the poorest nation, but one of the victims of. Oh, yeah. I mean, what I didn't, at that time when they were negotiating with the IMF, and these were not my words, this was one of the poorest nations, sorry, not the poorest nation. This was Stiglitz's argument that Ethiopia then was one of the poorest nations at that time, and they were trying to restructure their economy. I mean, they might be one of the poorest nations, but remember, Ethiopia was the only nation that was not colonized. Okay. And they have a very proud history of fighting any kind of colonialism and colonizations. So, yeah, I stand corrected. Not the poorest, but one of the poorest nations at that time. Good. Thank you, Abraham, for correcting me there. All right. So, any other questions about how to use some information about globalization and the influence of the global financial institutions in your research and writing? And you keep in mind that increasingly this knowledge is becoming really important in humanities research. And part of it, I mean, you can understand it in this sense, is that if you look at characters in a novel or a plot, I mean, after all, the authors live in this world, right? This word is Sukhdev. Japan was not colonized, but it was captured, right? And United States wrote its constitution. But Ethiopia, I was talking about Africa, and I don't think so. Japan is in Africa. So how do you use that knowledge? Liberia and Ethiopia were the only two nations in Africa that were not colonized, but Liberia was an offshoot of American former slaves who have gone and established the nation. So when you read a novel or a short story, you obviously understand that part of it, even if it's imaginary, the writer lives in this world. The text will have a certain politics. And so that's where this knowledge, what kind of the normal are they representing? If this world in which we exist is being offered as the reality which we must deal with and which we must understand, then that's where you come in and unpack that, right? That no, I mean, this isn't just so. Or you go into a novel and say, what kind of an impact will it have? Now, if you have a novel that is constantly talking about consumerism, constantly talking about this way of life as a normal way of life, then you can also write about it from the point of view of its impact, right? What does it normalize for the reader? Oroko, kindly redo the bit on the connection between Marxism and globalization. How does it affect the proletariat's good? Saleh, how about modern state formations? How states would be found without the political economic interventions? I mean, that's a very complicated question, how the modern states will be formed. I mean, part of the reason we already know that nationalism, as some theorists of nationalism would tell you, political nationalism, like Anthony D. Smith and others would tell you, rises in 17th century France and England. But then if you go and read Partha Chatterjee, Nation and Its Fragments, he would tell you that no, we didn't have to learn nationalism from the Europeans. Nationalism developed within the cultural realm, in the private sphere, and he gives you the examples of the rise of Indian nationalism. So I don't know what the purpose of your question is, but if you're trying to say that without an understanding of colonialism, without colonialism, there will be no nationalism, I mean, we don't know that, right? All we have is that history. But maybe these nations would have also developed into national economies. And I mean, the cultural concept of regional cultural empires and nations was always there. Now, more than ever, I mean, politically, I'm a post-nationalist. I don't practically believe in national borders. I think nationalism, especially chauvinistic nationalism, does more destruction in the world. But economically, there are very few autonomous nations in the world, right? Nations that can define their financial economic policy. And that's where I become slightly nationalistic, because I believe that there are certain things that only a national government can do, and they should be able to do it. Now, going back to Oroko's question about, so Oroko, if you look at how we can use the knowledge of Marxism and globalization, we can look at the rights of the labor, how labor is being exploited, what mechanisms are available for the global capitalism to exploit the labor. But if you read the works of people like Walden Bellow, Eduardo Galeano, and these other people who talk about a new form of proletariat, right, which is partly cognitariat, the knowledge workers of the world, and then the workers who do physical labor, that new forms of solidarities need to be developed. These solidarities will not be led through a hierarchy of a political party, a centralized political party, but their resistance to global capital would be rhizomatic in their own regions, but maybe they can then build lateral alliances. So that is something that we can use as a model instead of the pure Marxist model in which there was a centralized Third International, Second International, and a centralized Communist Party and a global proletariat. We can build regional proletariats and cognitariats who are aligned in solidarity against the imperatives of globalization. A good book on that would be Franco Berardi's, right? The Soul at Work, which explains where the global economy is and what are its psychosomatic impacts on people. So Saleh, I think I answered your question. Is I don't know where you are going with this because obviously we are not discussing nationalism. But I have no problem with this thesis that collapse of empires, you know, led to rise of nationalism, that colonialism also led to rise of nationalisms. But that's a completely different debate. I mean, I have expertise in nationalism and nationalist theories. I have quite a few videos on it. But I am not suggesting it's not like that, but there is no point of discussing that on this forum today because, um, you know, that what difference does it make how the nations came to be? What we are talking about is how to use the knowledge of neoliberalism to write about literary texts today. And I agree. I mean, there are different narratives of how nations rise. And if just the names of Partha Chatterjee has a book on nation and its fragments. You know, Anthony D. Smith has a book on how nationalism rises. Ernest Gellner has a whole book on rise of nationalism. Ali Kheduri has a whole book on rise of nationalism, right? And then Benedict Anderson has a whole book on rise of nationalism. Each one of them tries to trace different historical, philosophical reasons for rise of nationalism. So depending on what you are saying, whichever you choose, as long as you can argue for it, is the rise of nationalism, right? There is no single theory of rise of nationalism, post-war or pre-war nationalism. So I'm going to leave it at that. Abraham, is it possible non-Western countries to establish their own financial system to get rid of Western domination? I don't know. I mean, if you look at the non-aligned movement, right, they had tried to at least build a political coalition against the power of the North Atlantic region. And it may be possible now to come up with an alternative system if they can come together. Like China is kind of spearheading a counterweight to the power of IMF and all, but that comes with its own problems, you know. And the biggest problem of them all is, yeah, Eric Hobsbawm too, yes, and that comes with its own problems. I mean, because yeah, it's a economic giant, it's everything else, but it's a one-party political system which calls itself the Communist Party of China and does nothing communist, right? Other than being totalitarian. But there are loose alliances of nations. And I don't know if they can do it, but it would be something good to think about and try. Or if not that, at least change these institutions, right? Or force, you know, challenge what policies are there and how to fight them together, you know, as a coalition of nations, developing nations and others. But by and large, you know, the global economic system is lopsided. There are some very powerful nations, right? And they don't do it directly, but by and large, their interest is safeguarded by these global institutions. Of course, China is part of that system now. So is Russia. right? So is Japan. Japan has very highly weighted votes in IMF policy and all. So it's not just the West. Yeah. Okay. So any other questions? Okay. So Kimi, let's see. I have Kimigisa. Thank you for your intellectual labor. I'm not in the academy, but as a journalist, I find your videos and analysis very useful to how I approach covering electric politics in Uganda. Great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us. So Sukhdev, how do you view Rabindranath Tagore on wages of it is resonating in India again? I mean, to be honest, I have not really read it, but here is the problem with nationalism that I have, and that problem is with chauvinistic nationalism, right? Um, I mean, if you look at India's example, if you look at early Indian constitution, how it was structured, it took into account that India is a diverse nation with very different constituencies and large minorities, right? And that constitution was then married to a socialistic way of developing Indian economy, right? So India was one of the very few protectionist economies until 1980. And those of you who live in Pakistan and grew up in the 70s, Pakistanis used to laugh because they could get the Japanese and German cameras, but the Indians couldn't, right? But what India was doing was building the 10th largest industrial base in the world, right? And they did that with 5-year plans. And I'm not saying India didn't have any problems, but when in 1980 India opens up its economy, it's not just a free for all. When the foreign companies come in, they have local competition, right? They have to fight against that. So the success of the Indian experiment was then built into that cosmopolitan constitution, right? Which at least tried to take in account the complexities of Indian culture. When you bring in Hindu chauvinistic nationalism and bring in a majoritarian interpretation of the nation of India, they might have some financial success and all, but it will tear apart the fabric of Indian nation as we know it, right? And if it does that, then the political understanding of what constitutes India would become more frayed. And since the success was built on a multi-ethnic understanding of the nation, right, that will bring India as a nation to crisis. You can't have, large minorities, Hindu and non-Hindu minorities in a huge complex nation and somehow get away with saying this one group is superior to others. That's not how you build a modern democracy. So I see the rise of chauvinistic nationalism in India as a destructive thing for India, right? I see the rise of chauvinistic nationalism in United States as a thing destructive for United States. And so that's kind of my take on that. So I have Irfan Hassan. Let's see. Our educational practices are also like economy structured on the Western lines. We are not only importing theories and ideas from West, but the and teach today are also imported, right? Yeah, I agree with you, but I I have no problem with that. You know, I have no problem with importing knowledge, right? I have no problem with borrowing from others. But I have a problem when you say, oh, if this is not from America, it's not worthy of my attention. Or if it is not theorized through Foucault and Derrida, it's not worthy of my attention. That's where decoloniality comes in, where we tell people, yeah, Shakespeare was great, but so was Ghalib, right? So was Tagore. Um, so I agree with you that I am in touch with a lot of people. It's not just what formalistically is there in institutions. It's also how people view certain things, how they view English departments, how they even view what accent you speak in. Those are the legacies that we need to, kind of get rid of. But as far as knowledge is concerned, I was like, bring your Foucault, read him, challenge him, make him your own, infuse it with your own knowledge. I'm not for a totally purist retrieval of any history and mobilizing it as a counterweight to the West. There is no single West, just like there is no single East. But the dominant nations of the world, of which some Eastern nations are a part, have a lot of power in global economy. That's why most of the times we use the North Atlantic region. And there is, and that they need to be challenged, right? And then within that, as long as you don't just use a purist ideology of Muslimhood or Hinduhood or whatever, and you're trying to challenge the assumptions of any body of knowledge, no matter where it comes from, I think that would be a worthy pursuit. I just don't believe in these strict binary structures. Okay, do you have any recommendations of globalization's theory? Well, not any specific ones, but on my website, I do have a list of books. Um, but I also have quite a few videos that cover neoliberalism and globalization. And if you look down at the description of those videos, you will see some of the texts that I've read and that I like. That, but I'm pretty sure if you do a search on global cinema or globalization and cinema, a lot of materials will come up. Sukhdev. Do you see danger to nationalism with the rise of hyper-nationalism under the guise of cultural nationalism? Yeah, I mean, not just to nationalism, but danger to, people living within a national territory, but living in peace, knowing that they might be different, that their neighbor might be a Sikh, their other neighbor might be a Hindu or a Muslim, but still thinking of themselves as Pakistanis, as Hindus, as Bengalis or Bangladeshis. I think when hyper-nationalism connected to one single ethnic or religious identity becomes dominant, it by its very nature then starts excluding those who don't fit that paradigm, right? And that is dangerous to an idea of a civic nation or civic nation state, because and that comes from, of course, Clifford Geertz, right? The concept of the civic nation in opposition to primordial nations, right? Uh, so the danger in that kind of hyper ethnic or hyper religious confessional nationalism is that it creates an outside. It converts neighbors into enemies or into people who may not be wanted, right? And I think that's one aspect of nationalism that is really dangerous. Now, those of you who have read the history of the partition, I mean, both sides teach like the sanitized version of it, or just make the other. Well, where I come from, the region I come from is Gujar Khan, right? And almost all our villages were multi-religious villages, right? We had Sikh neighbors, we had Hindu neighbors, we had Muslim neighbors, right? And they all lived in these mixed communities. They practiced their own religions. Maybe there were no intermarriages, but they had no history in these villages, at least, of like me walking to my neighbor's house because he or she is sick and attacking them. That divide was politically produced through nationalism, right? And we ended up killing each other in thousands upon thousands. Same communities who had lived together for centuries. So, nationalism or hyper nationalism assigned to a dominant ethnicity or a dominant religion has huge problems. Yeah, so I agree with you. I will never allow patriotism to triumph over humanity. And that's where, if you look at, and we were talking about Marxism earlier, uh, First World War was the one that killed that idea of a global proletariat. Okay. The idea behind a global proletariat was that since all of these people share the same conditions of existence, a la Marx, their consciousness would be similar and they constitute a class. But nationalism cuts across it because in the First World War, in the trench warfare, who was fighting in the trenches? The proletariat, right? And they were killing each other in thousands and millions. So not only does nationalism cut across understanding humanity itself and living as human beings, it also cuts across class. It can pitch the same class against the other because I'm thinking of myself as a Pakistani, you're thinking of yourself as an Indian, right? So I agree with you there. So Irfan, the question I wanted to ask is that why are parts of the world are intellectually apparent so negligible if we see it in relation to West in the global intellectual? Well, I wouldn't say that. So first of all, no one is inherently intellectually better or worse. The reason is very infrastructural. Okay, so I mean, think of Pakistani universities. First of all, they don't have the resources. They have not built the resources, right? There is not even a single Pakistani university that has a world-class library, right? So you're already putting the people in a situation where they cannot access most of the resources that already exist. Part of it also is that knowledge is controlled by, at this moment, 6 global corporations. All scientific and social science knowledge is produced by 6 corporations. And not many universities here can even afford that. So first is the infrastructural problem. We have not invested in education that much. Then we have an elite class that has their own idea of what constitutes being educated. And part of it is an unreflected copying of whatever is trendy in the West, right? But then there is no culture in which inquiry and publishing is encouraged or taught. People do that because they want to get promoted and then they find their shortcuts. So part of it is infrastructural, part of it is whatever our colonial legacy was, and part of it is that not much money is being invested in education. Now, where I would fault the intellectuals, let's say, mostly in Pakistan, India has some really, really brilliant scholars, is that those who become very senior, they stop producing, right? And they get into this game of power and all. And part of it is also, I mean, sanctions, the fear. I mean, if you are a humanities scholar in Pakistan, there are things you absolutely cannot write and publish about because your life would be imperiled, right? So you can't criticize the army or can't even do deep analysis of the actions of the generals or whatever because you'll get in trouble. You cannot really question the basic assumptions of faith, right? Because if you do that, you'll get in trouble. Now, if you look at the rise of Western philosophy, part of it was inaugurated by the rise of secular thought when people started challenging the claims of the theologians, right? The early philosophers, the ideologists were religious scholars, right? They were trying to find God, right? Now, if you have a society in which you can't really deeply philosophically question matters of faith or criticize them, can't criticize the state institutions without getting in trouble, you are already being trained to limit your thought and the work that you produce. And if you do that, that puts you at a disadvantage, right? So there are structural reasons, there are personal reasons, right? And then there are reasons of resources. All of those combined then produce an intellectual class that is globally not competitive. It's not that they don't know their Western theory, it's that they don't even know their own history and cannot mobilize it to challenge the global assumptions. So these are like my thoughts about, particularly about Pakistan, and and a lot of problem lies with how the universities are organized, how they are run, what is privileged, right? And Nadeem Khan, how nationalism has contributed to populism in the country. Well, I mean, I think they are interrelated. You know, you have to have some form of chauvinistic nationalism. And then within that, pretty much always some form of populist thought process comes up because they connect it to the idea of the nation and then what needs to be done. And if you take away the leftist thought, right, which is progressive, but which also wants to change the world, then all you're left with is rise of populist nationalism or fundamentalism or religious nationalism, because you took away the very core of secular progressivism, which was the Marxist way of thinking about the nation itself. Sukhdev, don't you think humanities are worse targets of the ruling elite in the third world countries? Yeah, and there is a reason behind it, I think. Part of it is that when they make an economic argument, or the argument is, what are you going to do with the humanities degree? Because they want to put more money in STEM disciplines. Sometimes IMF mandates that if there are some funds for education, they should go to business or STEM. But the other is that there is this mythology that humanistic education is a waste of time, but also it creates these lazy, agitational people, young people, their minds get corrupted and they cause unrest. Then there is also, if you are in a religious confessional nation, there is this threat that humanistic education will bring the religious doctrine to crisis, right? And all of these things, on one hand, make humanities a target, but they also teach us something, that whether they like it or not, most people in power think of humanities as a threat to the status quo. So that means they at least acknowledge that humanistic education has the possibility to change people's minds and maybe to work towards local and global change, right? Uh, okay, thank you, Irfan. Thank you so much. So, by and large, we have covered quite a lot of areas today. And so I'm going to just try to sum up. So, in terms of the global policies, it's good to really understand the structure of these global institutions and then read up on how is it that they still control so much of what happens economically in so many different countries, which has political consequences, right? If a government cannot deliver because of certain global imperatives, they will fail, and something more oppressive or more reactionary would take up, will fill that gap. And then knowing that then enables you to read a novel or a short story or a memoir and ask yourself, which point of view is this story normalizing? Why are the characters in it a certain way, right? And if they are, what determines that? If they're bought into this mythology of the global village, what are the consequences of that? Or if they have become these insular hyper nationalist beings, what are the consequences of that? So the idea is not to repudiate a global international vision, but to make it better, right? To make it, as Joseph Stiglitz say, to make globalization work for all and not just for a few privileged nations. So let's see. Irfan, I am a student of history. History has become one of the victims of current capitalistic system of intellectual onslaught. How has knowledge been shaped? Well, that's a really good question, shaped by capitalistic interests. I mean, think of it. I mean, we are made here to education, we call it education industry, right? Universities are structured like corporations, top heavy, right? And they sell a commodity called education. So when you think of education in economic terms, when you deliver it like a corporation delivers its products, when you look at students as potential customers, right? Then that is the model of the corporatized university that Chomsky writes about, that, Henry Giroux writes about, right? And against that, then what can you do? People like me, we work in the same university. Well, the least we can do is make our courses so that they at least point to this corporatization of education instead of just saying we are deliverer of knowledge, right? And then we can also point to how to think critically about the system in which you exist, how to develop those capacities. On a larger scale, of course, we would want a greater change, but at least being aware of the economism of the university system itself would be the first good step. Okay, so we, the left, are in so small amount to challenge the majority. How to overcome them? By the way, I am from Swat. We are yeah. Well, the thing is, we always think in heroic terms, right? Because our idea of change is that, it has to be monumental. I always advocate for small changes, like small victories. Build your alliances wherever you can find them, right? Uh, Keep those alliances current, but work for small changes here and there. And if you can't change anything, show people, how generous you yourself can be, how kind you yourself can be. If you have a small class of 18 students, don't just deliver content, right? Deliver to them some mode of thinking different from what others are thinking. If they challenge you, fine. But maybe two, three of them would listen to you. But constantly keep building your solidarities. It's, the power, the implacable power of all these forces that are arrayed against these kind of thoughts is huge. But so are the numbers of people who want a better world. The only thing is that we have to constantly keep thinking differently. We have to constantly keep finding ways of expressing ourselves differently, and then, wherever possible, sharing those thoughts with whosoever you can share it with. But, we live in America, and here too, if you're on the left, you already feel like, you've lost the battle, right? Because there are very few people who would actually stand up and stand in solidarity with you. But you just focus on the little that you have and not worry about this large ocean of, oppression and all. Okay, so Alauddin Khan, you have a question about imaginary homelands. Well, I have a whole video on it. Okay, a lot of people assume that Salman Rushdie in Imaginary Homelands is theorizing about nationalism. He is not. That is a collection of essays, right? And one essay in that is Imaginary Homelands. And I strongly recommend you should watch that video. It's available on the channel. Just do a search on Imaginary Homelands and it will come up. All right. So we've been going for about an hour. I think I've answered all the questions. So thank you all so much. I'm glad to be back, and I may not be able to do this for the next few weeks because I'll be traveling. But whenever possible, we will decide a topic and have a conversation about it. Thank you all so much for your wonderful contribution and for really, really asking some really wonderful questions. And I'm going to call it a day at this and then come back sometime in the future. Uh, Thank you so much for joining me today. So, as always, I will now see you next time. And then I will, come back with some more. And Sukhdev ji, is publisher Paris policy delivering in the West? Yes and no. It is delivering in terms of people being forced to publish, but it is also forcing a lot of good people out of the academy. The good part is that publish and perish here is not really misused. People don't like make themselves co-authors with their graduate students' papers or put their name with their wife's paper. So in that sense, there is more integrity to the system. The problem in Pakistan that I'm seeing is that every single graduate student who's working with a professor, when they try to publish their paper, the professor wants to be listed as a co-author, right? And that part of the publish and perish mandate that they're creating in Pakistan is creating even a worse situation where people can come and claim, I have 150 articles, right? But they don't have an oeuvre. They have not produced a body of work that is coherent and has some progression. They have 150 articles because they added their name to every article that their students published. So I think to some extent, publish and perish can be a good incentive. But I would rather have scholars who just want to study and learn so that they're motivated about producing something new and fresh, or at least they're motivated about challenging, the world and as it exists. So that is how my idea is. So that's all. I will be traveling to Ohio to be with my wife's family. So I'm taking about a 1 month vacation, but we'll see if my internet there is stable. Maybe I'll come back and have another conversation. So, all right. Thank you all so much. Thank you for always joining me. And I will now see you next week. Thank you and peace and love.